I missed yesterday because I was teaching a cartography class, and taking my daughter to ballet. But I like the Scandinavian death metal better. I'm Jim. I'm an assistant professor at University of Washington, Tacoma. I guess I'll say what I would have said had I gotten off my ass and sent her the introduction. My first book came out this year. It's Thinking Big Data and Geography. My next one should be out next year with Pluto Press. It's Data Power, Resisting Algorithms in Everyday Life. So that's kind of the perspective I come from. And I wanted to actually spend some time thinking about what does it mean to do critical cartography? So that's my talk, and a spoiler alert is kind of there is. So the talk outline, I'll go over the origins of this project and kind of how it developed out of a set of work I was doing in critical GIS over the past 4 years. Then I'll sort of talk about previous and current thinking, and then I'll sort of go into future directions. If you read the abstract that I sent in, I thought what I was going to do is look at a bunch of maps, maybe do some neat machine learning on analysis of common types, because I like to do that, and then talk about if you can say if something is critical or not. Is there an actual praxis that makes it different than other maps? And then I didn't really get around to that, because as often happens with me, I got really caught up in reading the history. And so let me see if I can convince you why I care if there's a praxis of critical cartography, and why I think you should as well. So a few years back, I came out with this piece, Revisiting Critical GIS, and we sort of it was kind of a survey piece on where is critical GIS now versus where it was a while back. And the key to writing that is you take 30 people to an island, and then you force EPA to have a 2-page author list, which I think is my greatest accomplishment as a academic. But more generally, what we did there, sorry, I thought there was one more slide. More generally, what we did there was just look at if critical GIS was this very well-defined thing in the late 90s and early 2000s, then what has it become in the past decade or so, and does it still have parlance today? And some people feel very strongly that it doesn't. I don't agree with them, though. So coming out of that, we did some quantitative work, and this is a piece that I did with Luke Bergman at UBC and David O'Sullivan. Well, he was at Berkeley. He's now at back in New Zealand. And what this is we took 3,973 articles and all of their citations published in CAGIS, Geoinformatica, the IJGIS, and Transactions in GIS from 1990 to 2016. And we did, this is what's called a k-means cluster, which I think the K is 6 on this version. We sort of fiddled with it about. And what you see emerging, all the way out is the earliest, and the center was kind of the present being 2016 there. And if something shared 6 citations with something else, that's what the k-means 6 is, you can adjust that, this is in Gephi, it would get assigned into a track. And what immediately popped out, and was kind of neat, because there are obviously limitations to bibliometric analysis, but what immediately popped out was some of the major trends within the discipline of GI science. And we had mainstream, which kind of Tobler, and the size. I do apologize that you can't really read all this. The size of the text is actually the number of overall citations that the piece has. So obviously you can see Tobler 1970, you can see Goodchild, that's the VGS piece. You can see like Dijkstra's 1959, Hagerstrand 1970. So you can see this is a Burroughs 1998 for raster DEM stuff, McEachran 95 over here for like cartography visualization. You can see these streams immediately emerge where you have sort of urban analytics, you have time geographies, you have kind of like raster DEM work. And the lines between them are sort of the likelihood to self-citate. So if there's a citation between 2 pieces, there's a line, and the color of the line is for the citing literature. This isn't meant this was meant for a GIS article. It's really not meant for a cartography thing, so please don't critique it from that perspective. I just really want you, it's ugly is what I'm saying. I just want you to sort of see that you can see these kind of self-cite, especially raster is really strong, that raster DEM analysis tends to be very self-contained in their work. And so from that, we tried to create like, hey, what about these shared concepts again? What if like GI science and critical GIS were friends again? And it didn't work. But I want you to take a look at that unlabeled one in the first one. That is, in some senses, critical GIS / critical cartography. And it's not really showing up here, but it's similarly very self-contained. You can see this has the most kind of citations out, then this guy, then this guy. So I started thinking, well, why is that? Or maybe less formally, and n-grams are terrible ways to do research, but this is just sort of, if you look at, say, mentions overall, and then if you look at a mention between critical cartography versus critical GIS, at sometime around 2007 or so, critical GIS is like, woo, I'm going to take over as the discourse of critical theory, I guess. So what's happening is kind of what I was wondering. Why is that happening? Why, if I pull sort of 4,000 or 10,000 articles and I just look at the citation literatures, the bibliometric analysis, why do these trends emerge, but the critical sort of stays off by itself? So what does it mean to self-identify as a critical cartographer besides that, you know, your friends laugh at you and point sometimes? So one story, and this is kind of the story that if you go and check out textbooks, you get in the late 1980s, drawing on the current English translations of Foucault and Derrida, Harley deconstructs the map. He calls attention to those aporias, blind spots, or moments of self-contradiction in all maps, right? So it's from the 1989 piece. And that's a really limited story, even if it's the story that we most often tell ourselves in kind of academic histories, right? If you check out Rose Redwood's collection on the 25th anniversary of deconstructing the map, he really points out strongly that there's a reliance on what was translated into English of Foucault at that time, which is not what is translated into English today, specifically starting kind of in 2008 with the translations of Society Must Be Defended and Birth of Biopolitics and things like that. Crampton in 2003 points out that it's still mired in modernist takes on maps revealing the truth, so you can deconstruct it, but there's still ultimately a truth of representation there. And I think one of the more telling critiques of that history, and I'm not critiquing Harley here, I'm critiquing the history of how we talk about critical cartography, is that it ignores longer histories of questioning ontological truth in maps that can be found in feminist STS, Haraway and others, the situationists, which are kind of where I often find myself hanging out theoretically, and also indigenous mappings as well. And so what we get in that story, though, is that, as Chris Perkins writes in 2003, addressing how maps work involves asking different questions than those that relate to the power of the medium. And he says that a reconciliation between approaches is unlikely to take place. And I know that to me, 2003 seems like really recent, because that's when I graduated undergrad. It's actually quite a long time ago. Turns out. And what Perkins is saying back then is that, you know, our classic visualization time cube and if people don't recognize this map, this is the Squirrel Highways from Dennis Wood's Everything Sings. These guys don't get along and they never will, and that's just too bad. We can't be friends. But then we get this move from representation to process that sort of pops up. You can actually see the early rumblings of it in the literature, and this again is a specific academic literature that does have its own blind spots because it's obviously Western made and what have you. But you see a move from representation to process, from ontologically secure to ontogenetic, the idea that maps are always being produced as we read them, right? And what Kakad in 2015 argues is that this opens the space for the combination of critical positioning with empirist practices. In other words, through the view of maps as processual, suddenly critical cartography and kind of empirical and cognitive research into map, which in some ways derives from kind of the old map communications model, can get along. That there's no longer the intractable differences that Perkins saw in 2003. Of course, which is funny because Perkins is an editor on this book. Set up a problem and then find the solution to it is a great way to get citations, huh? And this goes on for some time, though, in this processual moment, where if we just all think of maps in this different way, suddenly we'll get something different to come out of it. Like now, for example, and Matt Edney's work is really great, and I really like it. I'm not taking random potshots at him, but if you look at he has a book coming out in 2019, which is Cartography: The Ideal and Its History, which is sort of coming out of that history of cartography's project that he served on for decades now. In this book, we disavow the term cartography. Rather than treating maps as a single unified group, he argues scholars need to take a processual approach. Okay, but people have been sort of talking about that since 2004. But the study of cartography will never be the same again, guys. It's just changing forever. Okay. So now what? And that's the question that's where I am. Because I haven't had that chance to just look at all the different maps and throw my machine learning at things. If just thinking about maps processually and making them ontogenetic instead of ontologically secure, and in always calling them into question into their very productions, is going to change cartography forever, then why hasn't it? It's been over a decade, and there's still not that much communication between the different factions, and there's not a lot of understanding of what it means to practice critical cartography besides a certain form of map critique that is predominantly political in its orientation, which, by the way, I'm fine with, and I practice, and I'm not saying it's worthless, but I'm wondering now what? So I would argue that deep histories still matter because they show us how we can go from things like this. This is the movement of sample households displaced by urban renewal in the Trumbull community from the 4th Detroit Geography Expedition and Institute into this, which is mapping relocation from the anti-eviction mapping project in San Francisco, which is currently ongoing. And you can see that they're obviously very similar in many of their visual, in both their visual orientation, which I think is spectacular in some ways, but also in terms of what they're trying to show. But so too does our practice, right? So the next step of what I'm going to do is actually interview a bunch of critical cartographers, and specifically work that does combine multiple approaches. And I think a great example of that is Megan Kelly's work right now in feminist cartographies. I think that's just a really interesting and important project. And then, because it's me, I'll still keep reading the literatures and charting this kind of history of academic text. But I do want to know if you can see a critical cartography, right? And here, I think in some ways you can. It's not just the topic, but it's also the representations, I would argue. And as far as what maps are, more than processual, I think that we might want to look at how maps are called into being and what it means when you suggest from the very beginning that something is or is not a map. And I'll leave you with this sweet meme, and that's my talk.